Ken will be familiar to many people, but of course, Ken's a retired journalist, and through his work and in his retirement, he's a great passion for local history and the industry and people of the region. He has published many books on the history of mining, the Great Northern Miners, Echoes of Northeast Miners, and Splendor of the Gala people will have seen many of those books, both in our library and for sale. He's also interviewed many former miners from the Northeast, but aside from his interest in mining heritage, he also has a very strong interest in the Tyneside shipbuilding, which is where he's going to talk to us this evening, as well as the shipbuilding on the Tyne. He's also written books on the life of Lord Armstrong and the ship Turbinia. And moving from Turbinia to a slightly larger vessel tonight, Ken is going to talk to us about the Carpathia. So I'll hand it over to Ken. Thank you.
Well, Carpathia, yes, the Tyne-built liner that rescued the Titanic survivors. On the morning of April the 15th, 1912, the Tyne-built passenger liner Carpathia carried out the rescue of the bitterly cold and traumatized survivors of the Titanic disaster. She had been 58 miles away from the sinking ship when she picked up her distress call, and she immediately responded by steaming into the night at full speed towards the Titanic's last reported position. Now we have to remember, she was steaming at her full speed into an ice field. Carpathia braved numerous icebergs in the hope of reaching the stricken ship before she slipped beneath the surface of the North Atlantic. However, when in fact she arrived at the disaster scene, there was no sign of the great White Star liner, which many had thought unsinkable. The Titanic had disappeared into the depths over an hour previously, with the loss of more than 1,500 lives. But Carpathia picked up the 700 plus survivors, passengers and crew, who had managed to board the ship's lifeboats. To the survivors, the Tyne ship must have seemed like a miracle as she steamed out of the dawn. Carpathia's birth on the Tyne had been accompanied, like so many ships, by emotions of pride and of happiness. It was on April the 24th, 1903, that the passenger cargo liner departed her fitting out quay at the Wallsend shipyard of CS Swan and Hunter. And Swan and Hunter was soon to merge with Wigham Richardson's company at the Neptune yard in Low Walker in order to build the Mauretania. Proud yard workers who had built Carpathia stood on the quay and cheered loudly as she began moving slowly down the Tyne for preliminary trials in the North Sea and delivery to her owners. And her owners, of course, were Cunard in Liverpool. So it was a thrilling moment for them, obviously, as it always is, to see the finished result of their labours and craftsmanship. She was yet another ship proving to the world the high standards achieved by the Tyne's naval architects and workmen. And we've got a picture here of Carpathia on the stocks at Wallsend, soon to be launched. In fact, Carpathia's keel had been laid down at Wallsend in 1901, and she was launched just under a year later in 1902. During the early stages of building the liner, I understand that excavations in the yard itself uncovered the eastern end of Hadrian's Wall, the so-called branch wall, leading down towards the river's edge from the Segedunum Roman fort. Now, what I understand from that is that at that point, the remains of the wall were actually in the yard, but today they're not. They're part of the Segedunum complex, I think. But that's quite interesting that as Carpathia was being built, part of the wall was discovered. The 558-foot-long vessel, bearing one tall funnel painted in Cunard's red and black livery, was of 13,555 gross tons, which is a measurement in terms of passenger ships of the cubic capacity of a ship. In other words, the spaces within a ship rather than the actual weight. So that 13,500 odd tons made her one of the company's intermediate-sized liners. She was equipped with two quadruple expansion engines built by the Wallsend Slipway and Engineering Company, whose works were situated, of course, only a short distance downriver from the shipyard, a very famous marine engineering company, of course. The engines were linked to two propellers, which gave her a top speed of around 15 knots. So she was a good 5 or 6, maybe even 7 knots slower than the Titanic. So Carpathia, this is Carpathia in dry dock on our picture here, possibly at Liverpool. Quite a good picture for the era. So Carpathia wasn't a sumptuous luxury liner. She was built to carry second and third class passengers, but the ship provided for relatively cheap fares a superior standard of accommodation for such travellers. So our picture here shows an entrance lobby aboard the ship. And in fact, you probably can just about make out the word Carpathia on the map there. We've also got another picture of the interior. At the date of her completion, she could take over 200 passengers in second class and more than 1,500 in third. Nearly 500 third class steerage passengers were provided with cabins, including 2, 4 and 6 berth. However, the majority in steerage were accommodated in dormitory areas. Besides passengers, the liner was equipped to carry chilled beef from the United States in refrigerated compartments. And among the most important items she also carried were the mails to and from America, earning her the title Royal Mail Ship or Royal Mail Steamer, RMS Carpathia. And this photo we've got here shows part of the third class dining room, very Spartan. I don't think anybody would tolerate that today. Later in her career, however, the ship would be provided with some first class cabins. And there's another shot of Carpathia in dry dock. After several successful trial runs over the measured mile in the North Sea, during which Carpathia exceeded the guaranteed speed, the ship prepared for her delivery voyage under the command of a Captain Barr. After departing the Tyne, she steamed northwards around Scotland to reach Liverpool. Carpathia sailed on her maiden voyage from Liverpool, bound for Boston on May the 5th, 1903. So it was in 1912, that's a good shot of Carpathia there, one very tall funnel you can see. It was in 1912 that she achieved worldwide fame. At this time, she was serving on the Trieste-New York route, carrying mainly Hungarian and Italian emigrants to a new life in the United States. And on her return trips from New York to Trieste, she would also take comfortably off US citizens on pleasure trips to the Mediterranean. So here you can see the start of tourism. Captain Arthur Rostron, in our picture, who was the master of Carpathia at the time, could not have been aware when his ship departed New York on April the 11th, 1912, that he would soon be called upon to launch a humanitarian mission of epic proportions. Rostron, who was born in Bolton, Lancashire, had been an officer with Cunard since 1895 and was given command of Carpathia in 1912 at the age of 42, in January 1912. It's clear, I think, that he was a man of rapid decisiveness and attention to detail. These qualities were combined with compassion, humanity, and a great ability to get his crew to respond to their utmost rapidly and efficiently. Captain Rostron was therefore aptly nicknamed the electric spark. He held a genuine Christian faith and was a believer in the power of prayer. The captain had been seen sometimes on the bridge to raise his cap and move his lips in quiet prayer. As his ship cleared New York Harbor early on the afternoon of April the 11th, another vessel on the other side of the Atlantic was departing from her anchorage off Queenstown, now known as Cove, of course, in Ireland. And that ship was on her maiden voyage from Southampton to New York, a voyage she would, of course, never complete. This 46,300-ton liner, the largest in the world at that date, was a four-funnel White Star Line giant carrying more than 2,200 passengers and crew. She bore a name which, of course, was destined to echo down the many years which have elapsed since. That one word, Titanic, remains indelibly printed on the face of 20th century history. Her maiden voyage was taking place, of course, amid a blaze of publicity, with some people claiming that she was virtually unsinkable. Like many ships at the time, she did not carry enough lifeboats to accommodate all those aboard. By the night of April the 14th, Carpathia was well on course for Gibraltar and about 1,000 miles east of New York. So she was making very good progress. The weather had turned bitterly cold, but the sky was wonderfully clear, with many stars and lights of the aurora borealis visible. And there we have a picture of the Titanic. I think that was taken in the Solent as she moved down the Solent. Sorry, got the wrong one. The ship's young wireless operator, that is of the Carpathia, Harold Cottam, had been on duty since early morning. By just after midnight, Cottam was extremely tired and he began preparing to turn into bed for the night. However, the enthusiastic young operator kept his earphones on as he began unlacing his boots. Cottam called the Titanic to tell them there was a batch of messages on the airwaves for the ship. It was then that Titanic's radio operator butted in with an extraordinary message. He asked Carpathia to come at once and added, "We have struck an iceberg." Very plain. The operator gave Titanic's position. He confirmed to Cottam that they required immediate assistance. Now, I think I've got a picture of Cottam testifying at one of the Titanic inquiries. Carpathia's stunned radio man raced to the bridge and told the officer on watch that Titanic had sent out a distress call. They then went to Rostron's cabin. The captain, who was trying to get some sleep, was irritated by their sudden entrance, as well he might be. For a few seconds, Rostron found the news that Titanic had hit a berg difficult to believe. Nevertheless, it was typical of him. He ordered the ship to be turned around. Then he thought, could such a disaster really be happening to this great ship on her maiden voyage? He asked Harold Cottam if he was absolutely certain the message was correct. The operator was adamant. Titanic had sent out the old distress call, CQD, come quickly danger, CQD, and also the new one, SOS. It is said to be one of the first, if not the very first, time in maritime history that the letters SOS had been used by a ship in distress. I don't think it was actually the first. Well, the captain's doubts were ended. He went to the chart room where he worked out that the stricken liner's reported position was 58 miles to the northwest of Carpathia. And Rostron then proved he was the electric spark. He sprang into immediate action. Carpathia began moving on a northwesterly bearing as she worked up to full steam. She was now sailing in the opposite direction to Gibraltar, towards an ice field, dotted with bergs and growlers. Now, growlers were smaller blocks of ice. Rostron showed efficiency as well as humanity as he meticulously prepared his ship for her rescue mission. He instructed that every member of the crew be served coffee to fortify them for the difficulties and hard work ahead. That's an interesting one, isn't it? The lifeboats were swung out in readiness to pick up survivors, and canvas ash bags were brought out so that small children could be brought aboard in them if necessary. Bosun's chairs were also made ready to lift other survivors. Gangway doors were opened and lines prepared for throwing to Titanic's lifeboats. Ladders were also fastened to Carpathia's sides and strong lights sighted at gangways. Rostron told the stewards to have blankets, soup, tea, coffee and brandy ready. The 2 dialing saloons became first aid stations, and the ship's 3 doctors, who were British, Hungarian and Italian, were posted to them. Well, he instructed the crew to go about their tasks as quietly as possible. But passengers began hearing activity. They began stirring in their cabins, and a few made their way to the open deck as the noise of intense activity aboard awoke them. Initially, some thought Carpathia herself was in trouble, and many were incredulous when they heard she was going to the rescue of the prestigious White Star liner, which many had thought unsinkable. Captain Rostron was clearly determined that Carpathia would be in a high state of readiness by the time she reached the disaster area. But could he reach the Titanic before she sank? The question, of course, must have plagued him continually as his ship raced through the early hours on a glass-like sea. So he did what he could to ensure the vessel's engines achieved their maximum potential. Her hot water was shut off so that all available heat could be turned into steam, and extra stokers were employed keeping the furnaces fed with coal. That was a tough job. It is likely Carpathia achieved a speed of between 15 and 16 knots during the next few hours. Later, it would be claimed she reached 17 knots or more, but I've been told by some marine engineers that that wouldn't have been possible for her engines, so you can take your pick. However, it is beyond doubt that her Wall's-End built engines really did serve her well on this occasion. Whatever her speed, Rostron must have been acutely aware of the risks ahead as he began the dash to the northwest in search of the ill-fated Titanic. His ship was carrying more than 700 passengers, and she was sailing at full steam during the night into waters where an ice field had been reported. It was a dangerous situation, and of course great care had to be taken with the helm. The lives of Carpathia's passengers and crew, as well as Titanic's survivors, were at stake. Accordingly, extra seamen were posted to keep lookout, and it was not long before the need for such action was confirmed. Carpathia began encountering a series of bergs, and she altered course to avoid them. A sharp lookout by the crew proved effective, and on at least one occasion a berg was spotted by starshine reflected from its surface. Carpathia was, of course, a more easily manoeuvred ship than the much larger Titanic, and she was travelling at a slower speed than in fact Titanic was when she struck the berg. Meanwhile, Cottam had radioed to Titanic that Carpathia was coming to their rescue as fast as she could. At 2:40 a.m., a green flare was sighted from the bridge. It was a long way ahead, but it sent a signal to Carpathia that human life was still active in the area of Titanic's last reported position. In reply, at 3 a.m., Carpathia began firing rockets at 15-minute intervals. They, of course, would tell of the rescue ship's approach. giving hope to any survivors. So the ship continued to weave her way through the ice field with the eyes of lookouts strained towards the horizon. But as they approached the disaster area, there was no sign of Titanic, though more green flares apparently were sighted. Rostron must have known then that he was too late. By 3:30 a.m., Carpathia found herself in the midst of countless bergs and growlers. He ordered the engines to be put on half speed ahead. They had taken around 3.5 hours to get there. Then, suddenly, a green flare shone out. It was almost at sea level. Then, as the first light of dawn streamed across the waters, Rostron and his men could just make out a lifeboat being rowed with difficulty towards Carpathia. All its occupants were exhausted, cold and numbed by their ordeal. The boat contained 25 women, 10 children, and 5 men. 4 of the men were at the oars. At the tiller was a young ship's officer. It was around 4:10 a.m. As the boat reached Carpathia's side, an officer and 2 seamen descended rope ladders and boarded her. I think that might be the first boat. I can't remember, but that is one of the boats, definitely. The boat was then maneuvered towards an open doorway and made fast with lines. The women and children were lifted aboard safely in bosun's chairs and canvas ash bags. The 5 men, some of whom were almost certainly seamen, managed to climb the ladder to the doorway. As the light grew, Rostron was able to make out other lifeboats scattered over a wide area. To the west of the ship, there was a large ice field, it included a number of tall bergs. To the south and east, there were other bergs. In later life, the captain was to state that when day broke and he saw the ice he had steamed through during the hours of darkness, he could only think that God's hand had been on the helm that night. The young Titanic officer in the first boat, James Boxall, was taken to the bridge where he told Rostron the Titanic had sunk. The great liner had foundered at 2:20 a.m. on April the 15th, 1912, with the loss of over 1,500 lives. So it must, of course, have been difficult for Rostron and his crew to take in. The water in Carpathia's vicinity was 33 degrees Fahrenheit, a mere 1 degree above freezing point. Anyone in the sea would not have survived long. Carpathia's crew continued the task of picking up the survivors. Her own passengers crowded the deck rails, watching the proceedings in stunned silence. Strangely, some of the boats were half empty, but others were packed to capacity. A great number of women survivors were now widows. In those days, of course, the policy was women and children first. Today, the policy is more to try and keep families together. And in fact, these widows searched in vain for their husbands aboard the rescue ship. Children were also without fathers. Out of 11 honeymoon couples on Titanic, only 1 man survived. One woman had become separated from her baby during the evacuation of Titanic, but unknown to her, the child had been taken safely aboard Carpathia. And in fact, happily, Captain Rostron was able to reunite mother and infant. She must have been incredibly relieved. The last of the lifeboats to reach Carpathia's side was carrying 75 people. It was very low in the water and in danger of being swamped or capsized. The sea was becoming choppy. But all, in fact, were embarked safely. The final person to board was this young man, Titanic's second officer, Charles Lightoller, who had taken command of the lifeboat and whose seamanship was invaluable in keeping it afloat. In all, there were just over 700 survivors. The figures given, sometimes you get in some accounts 705 survivors. I think Wikipedia gives 706 survivors, but other accounts suggest that the figure may have been 5 or 6 more, and it could have been 711 or 712. So again, this is something that is disputed. You get these various accounts, but certainly just over 700. 3 men died of shock and exposure soon after they were taken aboard. So how many lost their lives? Well, an estimated total of 1,503 people had died in an ocean tragedy which shocked the world. Again, the figure is sometimes disputed, sometimes a little bit more than 1,503, and sometimes a little bit less than that. I've recently seen a figure of 1,496. So I think it's fair to say approximately 1,500. Captain Edward Smith honourably went down with his ship. All of the liner's engineers also perished, a fate they shared with the ship's band, who, it's very well attested, kept on playing until near the very end as the decks grew increasingly steeper. There's Captain Smith, who was due to retire. That was to be his last voyage. Not a good way to end your career in shipping. Among the first-class passengers who lost their lives was John Jacob Astor, multi-millionaire businessman and hotel owner, who had been returning to America with his 19-year-old pregnant wife, Madeline, after visiting Europe and Egypt. Here's Madeline. She was one of the widows, of course, picked up by Carpathia, so she survived. Also among the very wealthy men lost was Benjamin Guggenheim of the US mining business empire. Isidor Straus, owner of Macy's department store in New York, and his wife Ida were 2 other rich Americans who failed to return from that tragic maiden voyage. Ida had decided to remain on board with her husband instead of boarding one of the boats. They bravely faced the end together, sitting in deck chairs as the slope of the great ship's decks grew increasingly steeper. Now, this is one of the Titanic's legends, that this marvelous legend that Benjamin Guggenheim and his valet also showed great courage combined with style. They went below decks, allegedly, removed their life jackets and warm clothes, changed into their dinner suits, and then returned to the open decks. Guggenheim declared that if they were going to die, they would do it like gentlemen. Believe it if you want. If you don't want to believe it, don't believe it. But it's a nice story anyway. They might already have been in their dinner suits for all we know. During the early stages of the ship's evacuation, a considerable number of the lifeboats were under-occupied and could have accommodated many more people. One example was lifeboat number 1, in which first-class passengers Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon and his wife, Lady Lucille, or Lady Lucy as she was known, escaped the ship. I think Lady Lucille was a bit of a fashionista. She was head of a fashion house anyway. So that lifeboat number 1 was lowered to the sea with only 12 people aboard, yet its capacity was 40. The officer in charge of lowering said he could see no other passengers in sight waiting to board at that stage. Yet, as it became clearer to passengers that the ship was definitely going to sink, the lifeboats became fuller. A larger proportion of third-class passengers lost their lives than first class. Only 24% in third class were rescued, as against 63% in first class. The crew survival rate was 23%, almost, of course, the same as that of the poorest passengers. Only 210 of the crew lived to tread the decks of Carpathia out of 898. And most of the crew a good proportion anyway were from Southampton. The northeast of England, where Carpathia had started her life, did not escape the losses. Among the crew members who died was Alfred King, described by the Newcastle Journal as a promising youth of Nile Street, Gateshead. He had worked for shipping equipment manufacturers Clark Chapman of Gateshead. He had always apparently wanted to go to sea. Alfred had been employed as a lift boy in first class. And I understand all the lift boys died. Engineer CFW Sidgwick from Sunderland was also lost. He was on his way to a new job in Mexico, and his wife had been due to follow him at a later date. They were newly married. William T. Stead, a famous campaigning journalist and former editor of the Northern Echo at Darlington, was another person on the casualty list. He had been born in Northumberland in 1849. I think he was born at Embleton. As the last of the survivors were being picked up at 8:30 a.m., the cargo ship California steamed into view from the west. She had been lying stopped amid ice during the night, and her radio operator had missed Titanic's distress call because he'd gone to bed. In those early days of wireless, there was no rule that there should be 24-hour radio cover, and most ships had only one operator. The Californian had now heard the news on the radio and asked Rostron if she could be of any help. Carpathia steamed slowly round the waters above Titanic's last resting place. Rostron, of course, was checking to see if there were any more survivors, but none were seen, or so we're told. Small items of wreckage were visible on the surface, including deck chairs. The Titanic now lay nearly 13,000 feet below the surface of the North Atlantic. The ship now became a vessel pervaded by a profound sense of loss, as well it might. Her flags were lowered to half-mast, and a service of remembrance of the dead and of thanksgiving for those rescued was held in the first-class dining saloon. The ship stopped briefly, and a funeral service was held for the 3 men who had died, and for a 4th who had passed away in one of the lifeboats. Their bodies were committed to the deep. The rescue ship's crew and passengers, they showed great kindness to the survivors, and many gave up their cabins for them. Indeed, Captain Rostron gave up his own cabin for 3 of the surviving women who had lost their husbands. That included Madeleine Astor. One newspaper headline called Carpathia the ship of widows. And here we have women passengers aboard Carpathia distributing clothes to the survivors. In fact, some of the survivors had evacuated Titanic wearing their dressing gowns or light clothing. Those people who had been in the water and managed to reach the boats had their wet clothes taken to the ship's ovens for drying. Rostron ordered that no information be divulged to the press. They would get their stories soon enough when Carpathia docked. But the captain instructed that a list of survivors be transmitted to the Cape Race radio station. This was sent via the White Star liner Olympic, sister ship of Titanic. Cottam was helped in this task by Titanic's junior radio operator, Harold Bride, who had been among those rescued. They also transmitted messages to relatives of survivors, but it was a difficult task because the airways were crowded with inquiries. Lightning punctuated the skies and heavy rain drenched Carpathia's decks as she entered New York Harbor on the evening of April the 18th, 1912. At the battery, thousands thronged the shore to watch her amid the storm. Lightning forked menacingly above the great city's skyline. Minutes earlier, the rescue ship had been greeted by an armada of small craft hired by newspaper reporters. They shouted through megaphones in an attempt to pick up rescue details from passengers. Well, they were only doing their job, I suppose. Some reporters had managed to get aboard the pilot boat, and they then tried to board the ship. Only one succeeded. He was confined to the bridge by Rostron, who felt that the survivors were in no fit state to be interviewed at that stage. Definitely. Carpathia berthed at Pier 54 from where she had started out at 9:30 p.m. and the survivors were disembarked safely. Titanic's junior radio operator, Harold Bride, seen here, was carried ashore, exhausted, his feet crushed and frostbitten. Because there were two operators on Titanic because it was a large ship. The epic rescue was over. After the passengers came off the liner, some were interviewed by reporters as they left the docks, and photographers fired off their flash cameras. The flashes were worked at that period by magnesium powder, so no digital photography in those days. In the days that followed, the White Star Line commissioned 3 ships to visit the vicinity of the sinking and search for the bodies of those lost. The crews of these vessels had a gruesome task. A total of 328 were recovered from the sea, and many were interred at cemeteries in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Others were reclaimed by relatives and buried elsewhere. A number of burials also took place at sea. Nearly a month after the tragedy, the liner Oceanic found a lifeboat from the Titanic drifting in the Atlantic. It contained the bodies of 3 men. Their burials took place at sea. On April the 24th, stokers of the White Star Liner Olympic went on strike shortly before the ship was due to leave Southampton. They refused to work on a vessel which they said had been equipped with old, collapsible lifeboats in poor condition. So what happened to Captain Rostron? Well, the career of Rostron never looked back after that momentous rescue of the Titanic survivors. A plaque bearing his portrait was put on show in New York's Hall of Fame, and he was presented with a US Congressional Medal of Honor. Later, he was to receive the Freedom of the City of New York. Other honors followed, including the Gold Medal of the New York Life-Saving Benevolent Association and the insignia of the French Legion of Honor. Molly Brown from Denver, a first-class passenger who had survived the sinking, presented Rostron with a silver cup from the survivors as a token of their grateful thanks and appreciation for his humanitarian actions. Molly Brown had offered compassionate help to others during the evacuation of the Titanic and to the survivors when they were aboard Carpathia. She even handled one of the oars in her lifeboat and later became known as the unsinkable Molly Brown. Between 1915 and 1926, Captain Rostron commanded Mauretania, which of course was the time's most famous passenger liner. In 1928, he was knighted, later becoming Commodore of the Cunard Line. Like the rockets he fired from his ship, he had shot to fame in one night of decisive action to save lives. But unlike the lights from those rockets, his fame never faded. The captain died in 1940. So he was the kind of hero. I'm not a great one for the cult of heroes, but he was I think you could say he was a hero. He certainly acted with decisiveness and humanity. And he had a lot of luck that night when his ship was steaming at full speed towards ice. But he was quite modest about things. And he, in fact, in his autobiography, Home from the Sea, he paid a tribute to the radio officer Harold Cottam. He was the man who was about to go to bed, but because of his enthusiasm, he kept his earphones on and he heard the distress call. And he said, Rostron said in his autobiography, "It was to the wireless officer in the Carpathia, through his attention to duty and his interest in his work, that I am indebted for the opportunity to do something really useful. And it was then that I got my feet firmly planted on the ladder of success." So I think Harold Cottam was as much a hero as the captain, in my view. So what became of Carpathia? It was a German U-boat which eventually ended her career. Ironically, in fact, sending her to rest on the Atlantic seabed like the Titanic. Carpathia was steaming in convoy from Liverpool to New York on July the 17th, 1918. The ships were about 120 miles southwest of the Fastnet Rock, Southern Ireland, of course. It was 9:15 a.m. 2 torpedoes hit the engine room amidships and another struck the vessel's forward section. 3 trimmers and 2 firemen were killed by the first torpedo explosion. The ship slipped beneath the waves 2.5 hours later. The 275 survivors were picked up by the mine-sweeping sloop HMS Snowdrop, which landed them safely at Liverpool. So the life of Carpathia had ended with a wartime attack, a fate she shared with many other merchant vessels of the First World War. But I think the liner from the Tyne and her crew had definitely won a lasting place in the honours list of humane deeds by ships and their crews upon the oceans of the world. Thank you very much.